When the Spirit of God descended upon Jesus in the River Jordan after his baptism, he led, or as some texts have, drove Jesus into the desert, where he experienced the three basic instinctual needs of human nature in the greatest intensity. And those are the temptations that will be read tomorrow at various liturgies throughout the Christian tradition. But evidently, these are important issues, because if he identified with the human condition, then it would be, at least in the tradition that we know of God in the Scripture, he would himself go through whatever he asked us to go through. So in the desert then, after 40 days and 40 nights of fasting, he was in a state of great vulnerability, not to mention hunger. So we notice then the three basic instincts appearing in these three temptations attributed to Satan. And the first one was change these stones into bread. And so the temptation was to rely on his own powers rather than on God, or on magic rather than on the divine power. So it describes the stark tradition, or confrontation, I guess is the better word, with the basic needs of human nature that every infant experiences, even in the womb. And that is for concrete security, that is to say, the basic needs for life that are totally reasonable and required. But Jesus answers that temptation with dependence on God and every word that comes from the mouth of God. Then the devil took him up on a temple and suggested he jump off to become acclaimed as a wonder worker. So this is obviously the temptation to fame, prestige, unlimited esteem, honor, affection, that is so necessary, at least from the point of view of affection, for the infant, that it find a welcoming reception when it comes into the world. And finally, the ultimate temptation to power. Satan suggested that Jesus bow down to him and he would give him all the nations of the world. Not that he had any control over those nations. The demons are a little presumptuous, to say the least. And in each, so Jesus dispatched him, saying, God, you must worship God alone and not power. So these were the temptations that everyone experiences, only in their most intense form. And so it is a further proof that Jesus, as God, has actually taken each of us to himself and identified with whatever temptations and whatever mistakes we've made in trying to find happiness in one of those projects. Once again, our identification with Christ is really our healing, provided, of course, that one consents to this process and accepts the gift of infinite mercy that's contained there. What happens to most of us, as you know, as we emerge into self-consciousness, the sense of separation from God that seems to occur very early in life, means that we're faced with this desire for happiness and not knowing what it is, but having a very real need and the sense of gratification when these needs are met for the symbols that the culture provides of power, affection, esteem, and security and survival. So if the infant didn't have those motives, it probably wouldn't survive infancy. But if any of them are withdrawn or withheld, and no parent is perfect, and the need, this gratification of those three instincts is unlimited, there's no rational powers to moderate these desires. For most people, it seems that they're identified themselves with the gratification of those instincts and experience them as happiness rather than what they are, which is the pleasure that goes with the gratification of one's desires. So the personality becomes identified with one or other or all of those particular needs. And so the false self begins to fossilize into programs for happiness, emphasizing one or other of those programs. And also the other pillar of the false self is over-identification with one's group, whether it be ethnic or national or religious or race or gang, for that matter. So this is the self that becomes more and more self-reflective as we approach early adolescence, and then becomes a fully reflective self-consciousness in mid-adolescence, perhaps. But instead of re-evaluating with those new powers the experience of its projects for happiness, it uses the immense new vigor and power of reason to think up bigger and better ways of finding programs for happiness that won't work. The issue here is really idolatry. Maybe that's putting it too strong. It's identifying happiness with something other than God, and that is a serious mistake. But there doesn't seem to be any way out of this, because we don't have the experience of God, and the child isn't capable of going to India or something to find spirituality out there. So it just keeps growing with a plan for happiness that is an illusion, and that traps us into seeking it in the wrong places, where we experience then frustration, disappointment. And whenever something we desire is frustrated, off go the afflictive emotions automatically: anger, grief, more complicated ones of jealousy, envy, greed, lust. In other words, the emotional apparatus of the child, although it's basically good, becomes solidified or fossilized in a certain program that circulates around what it regards as going to deliver happiness. And so it constantly recycles the same vicious circle of desire, frustration, more desire, more frustration, and until we have an approach to life that is really designed for human misery rather than happiness. So this is the the power of those instincts and desires are precisely what Jesus experienced in the desert. So that when we feel battered and beaten up by our emotional miscalculations, instead of being discouraged, we should ask Jesus to join us in our particular mess. After all, he's been in his own, so to speak. So it's familiar territory for him. And the acceptance of the practice of silence in some form enables us to get insight into how much power some of these desires have over us and our particular behavior, much of which is unconscious to us unless we take the spiritual journey into a practice like centering prayer or something equivalent. Another way to look at this process, since no one explanation is completely satisfying, you look at it from different perspectives, and hopefully each paradigm might throw a little light on another. Let's take a look at the whole process again from the perspective of a passage through consciousness. This is a term that, as far as I know, Bernadette Roberts has invented. And she has an interesting essay on this subject. But it's an intriguing way of looking at that material that I just described from a psychological perspective. So from the perspective of consciousness, here is the stages that we pass through if you are practicing some form of non-conceptual prayer. That is, if you enter into the contemplative process. So in the beginning, the infant, as far as we know, has no consciousness of self, no self-consciousness. It has consciousness, evidently, of what it's experiencing, but in the first 11 months or so, the developmental psychologists say the infant is pretty much identified with its experience, and that's why it shifts from joy to sorrow rather quickly. It goes from one thing to another, and is busy trying to fill its brain with various experiments with regard to the outside world, and then its socialization period moves this process along at a great rate. So after 11 months, it begins to experience a self-consciousness, and the false self begins to grow. Or if you prefer another word, ego does pretty well. Though the ego, it generally has a positive aspect for psychologists. Namely, one needs a certain degree of self-identity in order to function in this world. And so it seems to be a part of the ordinary developmental process. And since it's the development of an ego is not really our fault, it must be God's plan for us. So the plan seems to be to start out be in a pretty dire straits. Now, I don't know whether this is because the experiment with Adam and Eve didn't work out too well. They were allegedly started out with a perfect human nature that didn't have disease or death, according to theological explanations. And that's why they seem to be a little too ideal to be real. But it also suggests that the evolutionary process is part of God's plan and has an essential role to play in our human development. It's just that most people get stuck in that process and have a hard time moving on to the mature experience of human life that emphasizes love, and not any kind of love, but a love that is capable of sacrifice or of self-giving or self-surrender. So then, as this self-consciousness or ego develops, one may get involved with some religious practice, and all the religions are meant to start the process of transformation, or to convey us, so to speak, with the motivation of the different religious traditions towards the transformative comprehension of life. So that means that our religious practice is also under the influence of egoic motivation in the beginning. And this can apply to our spiritual life also, and to prayer. So perhaps pastors don't speak too much of this, because it's hard enough to get people to pray at all, let alone to tell them that their prayer is full of mixed motivation. They might say, well, I guess it's just too hard for me, and that's a hazard of preaching. Required some discretion, I suppose. But in actual fact, religious people, because they're leading a fairly respectable life, if they're practicing their religion, can miss the unmanageable character of their emotional programs for happiness, and not move on to leaving behind childish or emotional programs for happiness. In Bill W.'s last years as the founder of AA, or the principal founder, he noticed that many of those in recovery for 5 or 10 years became depressed, and he couldn't quite figure this out. He thought they experienced great freedom for a few years, and then he seemed to see an unusual large number of them fell into depression. And he did also. In fact, he was about 12 years, he says, in his correspondence with Father Dowling, a friend of his. So he was struggling all that time and trying to figure out why this was happening. Until one day he got the insight. Now, why he got the insight, it would be nice if we could know. But all his efforts began to pay off. At some point, waiting for God to heal us always works in the end. But it can be a long wait, especially if there's many obstacles to the healing process as are usually present in a serious addict. In any case, it suddenly became as clear as crystal to him that all his life he had tried to please everybody. Well, there's a formula for utter failure and distress and misery, because you're lucky if you can please a couple of people. But pleasing people is obviously that desire for affection and esteem carried to infinity. So the willingness to please others is a value, provided it's limited by other factors to a reasonable hope, and also an acceptance of the fact that you have this excessive desire and it's going to be frustrated, and you're willing to put up with the displeasure towards oneself that failure is going to cause. Because often the desire to please others has a compulsive attitude towards it, because the child, for some reason, found that worked at an earlier period in his life, and so he put all his or her stock into that project without knowing it, and simply pushed into the unconscious any doubts it had as to the value of that process. So if we want to please other people, there's almost certain some mixed motivation there, and it'll be something to work at. If you had the courage during Lent to displease someone you love to please, that might be a great project for Lent. The person involved might not understand this, but maybe you could prudently explain the situation to them. But it's amazing how hard it is to displease someone you really love deliberately for the motive of freedom. But it's the same for the other projects. Control and power are very attractive for aggressive personalities and other temperaments similarly disposed. So for them to let go of the control of something so slight, it's unbelievable. Security. Obviously, there's a reasonable security you have to take. It's the character of childhood programs for happiness that these instinctual needs that underlie the false self are based on is so strong, is because they worked up to a point as children, and there was no alternative as far as something that supported them in their needs. And so as the spiritual journey unfolds, one begins to perceive one's self-interest with greater clarity, that the false self or the ego puts the I at the center of the universe. Doesn't work. The center of the universe has some other axis that it works on. So the religious consciousness is a crucial battlefield towards higher states of consciousness, towards a deeper development of the potentials of the spiritual journey. And it's what all religions are designed to facilitate or to do or to convey us. As a result of letting go and of a practice of waiting upon God, of recognizing our mixed motivation, and above all of honesty in acknowledging our self-centered activities, then moments of pure consciousness may arise in prayer or through some other means. And pure consciousness is consciousness without particular content. In other words, one is beginning to sense the deeper reality from which we emerge or for which we're designed. And in the stages of prayer, it takes the form of a prayer of union, for instance, that St. Teresa speaks about. In other words, a few moments one is forgetful even of oneself. But these are not necessarily transformative experiences unless they continue and unless one takes advantages of them to pursue the spiritual journey with consistency and perseverance. It's impossible to imagine what God has prepared for those who love him, according to Paul, or one of those evangelists. And so the slightest attention to God or the slightest movement of love towards God is never lost, and it's more valuable than any other kind of good work. And the value, which is very important too, of the works of mercy and of justice and peace, is really a part of the love of God if it's rightly exercised. Sometimes if we plunge into works of charity before our own self-knowledge has reached a reasonable point so that we can step back from our particular acts and honestly observe our motivation, we sometimes practice good deeds, as Jesus pointed out to the Pharisees, to be seen, or for the praise of other people, or for the satisfaction of our own great idea of ourselves and our great love of humanity and whatnot. All true, but not quite true. There's a few other points that we'd like subtly, and you don't really see those refined motives, those hidden motives, without the help of a practice of silence and a occasional review, like at the end of the day, of when you felt upset during the day, because any feeling of upset is a certain sign of the false self in action. And as long as the false self is in action, it steals away the peace that is the climate, which is a kind of symbol or a significant symptom, if you like, of the development of this pure consciousness that can become a sort of background to all our other experience, whether mental or physical or whatever. So pure consciousness is a symptom of the true self awakening. And the true self involves the exercise of those special gifts of the Holy Spirit that we call the fruits of the Spirit: charity, joy, peace. Notice what they are. Charity is not just kind-heartedness, that's good too, but charity is the same kind of love that God has, that is unselfish, that doesn't seek any reward. So you can see that this involves some practice, and that it's not possible for us on our own power to climb up to this kind of self-denial or self-giftedness without the help of God's grace. And so as this pure consciousness develops and the exercise of the fruits and gifts of the Spirit, a further development might occur, and this is the full development of the ontological unconscious. That is to say, the full, all the possibilities that have been given to us through grace are beginning to bloom or blossom, you might say. Not getting us out of the usual troubles of everyday life, but enable us to bring to the difficulties of everyday life, and sometimes to great trials, this attitude or disposition of self-surrender in everything, and a willingness to do what God wants us to do, to heal or bring peace to situations where we can. But cosmic unconsciousness, or Christ consciousness, I should say, is the spontaneous perception of reality from this perspective of God's point of view, more and more, that's communicated through the fruits and gifts of the Spirit, so that wisdom an understanding, an insight into the mysteries of Christ's life, or being able to see the scriptures as not just a literal text, but as a spiritual communication of a wisdom that doesn't immediately appear in the text itself, but which the enlightened eye of faith begins to see deeper and deeper meanings in the same text as this process of transformation continues. And finally, there might come what might be called incarnational contemplation, which is a word David Frenette has invented, one of the teachers at the Denver Center in Colorado. By that he means, and I think it's a good choice of words, bringing the fruits and gifts of the Spirit and this pure consciousness into everyday life, so that all of our actions become motivated by divine love, and the experience of God's presence or absence is a very secondary concern, because the faith has begun to experience God as no experience. And this is actually the experience of God as unmanifest. Grace, sanctifying grace, and the sacraments and prayer are God's creative presence, you might say. But beyond that remains the mystery of what is unmanifested, which God has not or cannot reveal. And this is only accessible to a very developed faith. And it's that which sees in suffering or in difficulties or in things that are displeasing in oneself to oneself, a special opportunity to identify with Christ, who identified with us in our human difficulties and misery. So you'll notice, like in some texts where this identification of God with humans is emphasized, that it almost always invites us to identify with God in the same proportion as God has identified with us, which is total. Thus in the book of Revelation, that beautiful text, behold, I stand at the door and knock. Christ is supposed to be speaking in this text, or the Lord, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone at all opens, I will come in and have supper with that person, and he or she with me. Notice, he or she with me. So the process isn't complete by Christ identifying with us. It's completed by our identifying with Christ in his divinity, that is, actually becoming transformed into the equality, if that's not too strong a word, with God insofar as that's possible for humans. So the goal or ideal or the meaning of the Christian tradition, at least, and I think in other terms it belongs in other great religious traditions also, is that our human destiny is incomparable, and perhaps is just beginning as far as accessing these levels of human experience that are radically available now that many people have fully achieved rational level of consciousness, but who need to realize that this is still only a step on a journey that involves much more profound capacities and delight and enjoyment and healing of society. So this persevering then in a spiritual practice, and especially in a practice of contemplation, which seems like half of nothing or more than nothing to some people, is its very insignificance and humility and powerlessness are the very tools with which God heals those emotional programs for excessive security, excessive affection, pleasing everybody, or controlling as many things or people on God, if you could get away with it, or controlling ourselves. The great insight of the Christian journey is really enshrined in the first step of AA. We discovered that our lives were unmanageable. This conviction is what turns you over completely to God, not your virtues or your successes or what people think of your good works or your achievements. These are not proportionate to the inner experience of powerlessness that is actually who we really are in regard to these great spiritual invitations of God. Why would God be interested in giving himself away in so complete a way as this? In the epistle to the Philippians, Paul says this of Christ, that God, that is, Christ is Paul's word for God, especially God made flesh in Jesus Christ. God, he says, did not consider being God something to cling to, but emptied himself, notice, following the example of the Father who gives himself completely to the Son. So the Son, in becoming human, is giving up being God in order to become one with our weakness and poverty and so on. The beatitude of the poor in spirit is precisely this insight into the fact that our happiness really consists not in accomplishments, but in experiencing our total dependence on God. And so the more evidence that we have as we grow older of our need of God and the failure of our programs for happiness and the damage we do to our relationships by over-identification with our particular group. Not that it doesn't have values, but it's not God. It's not a complete value. So it's the capacity to let go of our idea of self that we formed in early childhood and developed through adolescence. A letting go of our idea of finding happiness in one of those three programs. And this needs the continuous grace of Christ, the friendship of Christ, or the continual practice of a contemplative method of prayer, because of the deep immersion that we have in our ideas or our image or our expectations of where happiness can be found. From the perspective of centering prayer, if you can hold it briefly in your mind's eye, the practice is similar to those stages of passage through consciousness. So when we sit down then to do centering prayer and introduce the word as a symbol of our consent to God's presence and action, this is the opening to of our consciousness to the transformative process. And this takes place in the prayer in the following way. First of all, of course, centering prayer doesn't put out of business all the other forms of prayer or ritual, which are very valuable in their own way. Centering prayer is the beginning of a movement towards a greater intimacy with God, and that involves a greater knowledge of who we are and what we're giving to God. And so we could have started out by suggesting that we first accept God. But acceptance can have with it some reluctance. And so consent is a little bit more in the sense that it's a willing or grateful consent to God's presence and action. It's not sort of a passive last-ditch or only alternative kind of grudging consent. It's a lively, happy, hopeful consent to God's presence and action. And this is an act of the will, not so much of the feelings. So it's a willingness, not a willfulness, to use a distinction by Gerald May. And so as we consent during the prayer by returning again and again to our original intent, as simply as possible, and without self-reflection insofar as we can, the consent turns into self-surrender, which is one of the prominent characteristics of contemplative prayer in the strict sense of the word. If you are moving into self-surrender to God's will as a habitual response to events and to situations and to your own weaknesses, then this transforming process is happening and you are a contemplative. It's the best, surest sign that this is really what you're doing and you're not just entering into some state of sheer emptiness or suspended animation. One is open and one's attention is not to a particular object or thought, but to a general loving attentiveness to God. Not attention, but attentiveness. The distinction that dawns on you more and more as time goes on and if you persevere. So this loving attentiveness means that the will, that all the times you return to your sacred symbol have coalesced, and like the individual images in a moving picture projector that are separate, but if you send them through a movie projector, at least the old-fashioned kind, fast enough, it gives you a sense of continuity, of a moving picture. It's not moving at all. It's just separate frames that go fast enough that it looks like it was moving. Well, in the case of the will, it doesn't just look like it's habitually surrendering to God, it eventually is surrendering. And so then when other thoughts come down the stream of consciousness, they bang against this established habit and they can't penetrate it. So they slip away or fall away and you don't make any impression on them. And if you do, then you quickly return, ever so gently, of course, to the sacred word and take up where you're left off, so that eventually you're collaborating in the Spirit's effort to heal the unconscious damage of a lifetime by the experience of pure consciousness, of faith that is not based on thoughts, but on love, on the experience of God's love, and sometimes the experience of God's affection. though the writers that have speak of affection as a sign of contemplative prayer don't necessarily mean sensible consolation. Just what they mean is very hard to describe because it's an experience that has no particular content, but only the general sense of love, peace, freedom, satisfaction, and so on. And so as this state moves into pure consciousness, you're in the third stage that Jesus speaks about in his formula. Beginning, enter the inner room, we close our eyes, let go of the external things that might be called external silence, and then we turn off the interior dialogue when we introduce the sacred word or the sacred symbol, and thus we cultivate interior silence. Well, this is on the edge then of contemplative prayer in the strict sense, and it only takes time to move over the edge, unless you get weary of waiting, do something else. But it's prayer in secret. Notice the cascading movement of the prayer from exterior silence to interior silence to secrecy. Well, what could that mean? It means relating to God the way God is, which is secret to us because his being is beyond any category or sense experience in itself that we can reach in this life, but not in the next. So we're letting go of the desire to experience God in a way that is self-satisfying. And thus we begin to experience charity as unselfish love, and the love that is not organized around reward. Hence, nothing can prevent it from continuing to grow. It's not limited by its idea of success or satisfaction or gratification. In other words, it's accepting God just as he is, just as he asks us to be who we are in giving ourselves to him. It doesn't have to be a prize package. On the contrary, perhaps God is closest to the weakest and most powerless in the human family. That seems to be suggested in many places in Scripture. And finally, then, the prayer in secrecy leads to the true self, and finally to what is beyond the true self, which is the divine indwelling. That is to say, God's actual presence within us that is secret from us in this life, but is little by little penetrates our disbelief, so to speak, by its reassurance, even in the midst of deep trials, that God is with us, and that with us means totally for us. And finally, there is the ultimate self. There is the you of our superficial self, our resume, and our physical presence in this world. The you of the ego, which is our motivation, our aspirations, our deepest personality and strivings. And there is the you of the true self. But there's an even more profound you. And this is why it's a good idea not to interrupt the journey if you can avoid it. And this is the fact, as John of the Cross puts it, that Christ is the center of the soul. That is to say, the divine word become flesh is our deepest self. And in that obviously means that we are Christ in the deeper sense of the word. As Augustine put it, the Christian community is one Christ loving himself in everyone. Or as Paul puts it, Christ is everything in everyone. Or God is all in all. All of these extravagant statements are not based on extravagance, but on a penetration of the ultimate meaning and reality of life at any level, and that is, it's all the divine life manifesting itself, its humility, its pure love, its beyond being itself. This is what we are invited to allow to happen in our own life. And if we don't get around to it during this short time we're on this globe, you might keep this in the back of your mind, that God has a trump card up his sleeve. He never is defeated because he doesn't want to win. This isn't the category. He just wants to love. So God loves us so much that there's almost nothing else you can give him better than allowing him to love you just as you are. And he'll fix whatever needs to be fixed, so you don't have to worry about that either, as far as I can see. But we have to change our idea of God from, maybe this is not a problem for the present generation, X, Y, or Z, or whatever you folks are. But for those older, the lingering harm and disaster of heresies like Jansenism and Pelagianism are surprisingly still prominent in teaching, in preaching, in education of a Christian kind. And this is hindering the return or development of contemplative prayer and the full extent of God's generosity. For instance, when Jesus says, I haven't come to save sinners, or rather, I haven't come to save the just, but sinners, the lost in some time. Well, that word in Hebrew means those who are totally shot, that is, hopeless, for whom nobody gives a chance. So it's the worst characters on earth that Jesus says he's come to rescue. Okay. So maybe there's a place for us in this plan. But the place will become more certain the more we recognize that our life under our power is unmanageable and that needs to be transformed by the infinite mercy, tenderness, love, motherliness, inexhaustible love of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit.